Hello, I have just finished Tales of Mystery and the Macabre by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is the fourth book I had on my list for the spooky October reading thing that people do and that I am doing this year, I think for the first time. And it was a great book. Now, I made notes. It's short stories. Short stories and me, not always best fit, but here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 short stories. Now, Elizabeth Gaskell, known as Mrs. Gaskell apparently in her day, was born in 1810, died in 1865, and she was a novelist, biographer, and short story writer. She is a fascinating woman in her own right. If no one ever wrote a biography on her, it was probably well worthwhile. She herself wrote a biography. The only biography was The Life of Charlotte Bronte, and she based part of that on actual interviews with Charlotte Bronte. It was published in 1857. I believe I read this years ago and I've forgotten it, but there's a tie-in to one of the stories in this book that is allegedly from a story told her from Charlotte Bronte. Now, I have got this, can't remember where I picked up this Wordsworth edition with a very, very good introduction by someone I was going to look up before this review, but I forgot. David Stuart Davies. Not sure who he is. Marvellous introduction. It really gives you a sense of Elizabeth Gaskell, her times, and the quite phenomenal fact of that she was this professional author writing under her own name, when she didn't, it doesn't sound like she really had to. It doesn't sound like she was doing it to earn money, like the Brontes did. It doesn't sound like she was making any attempt to disguise who she was. Fascinating story in itself. Anyhow, I'm pretty sure that I've read other stuff of hers other than the biography of Bronte, but I don't really remember too well what it was. Okay, so introducing the Mystery and Macabre stories. This is allegedly the first time all her stories are gathered together in one place. And some of them are a bit spooky and some of them are far more mystery. Anyhow, reviewing them one by one. First comes the old nurse's story. Now, this is the one that's allegedly based on a story told to Mrs. Gaskell by Charlotte Bronte. So that's kind of wild in itself, and I don't know if it's true or not, obviously, but this seems very much like the sort of story that Charlotte Bronte would have liked and might have told. It's the story of so you've got a lot here. In a lot of these stories, the house in which things happen is a big part of the narrative, and this is one of those. You've got your sweet innocent orphan, and that confused the hell out of me. It takes a while sometimes to sink into the writing style if you're reading something that was written a long time ago, and this was the case for me. So Gaskell starts off telling us about this one, that the nurse is telling the story to the children of her ward, I believe, much further on in time than when it actually happened. Your mother was an orphan and an only child. Your grandfather was something or other. Your grandmother was something else. And it just didn't compute in my head. Which brings me to the fact that the narration, while excellent, is very much of its time. And a modern reader will have to slow themselves down and just ride with the flow, and sometimes even reread the same thing over and over to make it compute. This orphan, but your grandparents were such and such, it does make sense when you try hard. So once I'd sunk into the story, this one was thoroughly engrossing and I enjoyed it a lot. Our narrator, as a very young woman of 17, had already been the nurse for a couple of years to her little ward, Rosamond, who was 5 or 6 at the time when she is orphaned and is taken to an isolated old manor house with these secretly malignant memories permutated through it. Rosamond is delightful, and she's beloved of the 2 old ladies who live there, through her relatives on her, I'm going to say probably father's side, and of all the servants and everything. And you've got this slow unfolding of events, which is common through all of the Gaskell stories that I read. And you've got, this is the spookiest of the spooky ones. You've got this old organ player who everyone calls the Old Lord when they admit that he's there. Most of the time they try to pretend this organ clattering through the hallways is actually the wind, which is unlikely. You've got Lady Weeping by the Thorn Tree. You've got a child ghost who leaves no footprints on the snow and who is trying to tempt Rosamond out to her doom. The nurse, Hester, tells us the whole very satisfying, very ghosty story, anger and revenge throughout. It's great. 5 stars for this story, hands down, without a question. The second one was the Squires Story. Now this one was much more mystery and misdeeds. You've got a strange Mr. Higgins who takes over the tenancy of a white house and moves himself in and ingratiates himself with all the lords from the county as well as the town. And eventually he marries the beautiful young daughter of the Lord of the Hunt or something like that. Can't remember exactly what it's called. And it does have a mildly macabre ending. It again surrounds a house very much. It was enjoyable without being crazy exciting. I'd give it 3 stars. And in this book story, as well as in a few others, Mrs. Gaskell leans into a thing that was very common in her lifetime, which is highwaymen. There's a whole heap of highwaymen of different kinds and under different names in this story, and one gets a sense of just how bad, cruel and feared they were in her day. Okay, the next story is the Poor Clare. This was a fine, strong story. It just gets better and better as you read through it, but it's very windy. It goes in lots of places and it goes over countries and over times and all over the place. The narrator here is male, and Elizabeth Gaskell had the delicious talent of being able to write across the gender gap exceptionally well, which not every writer today can manage. So that was really impressive. In many other ways, Gaskell is often surprisingly modern in her outlook and her opinions. Quite frequently while reading this, I thought this could almost have been written very recently. There's a sort of contemporary attitude to the world and a clarity of vision of society, I suppose I would call it, that does seem exceptionally contemporary for things that were written in the 1800s. Okay, so we're still on the Poor Clare. This story comes across as one that was probably very suited for the old periodicals, which is where Gaskell sold a lot of her work. She worked closely with Dickens, apparently, and many of the stories that she wrote were written specifically for him. This one feels as if it would have done well in a periodical with a bit printed every week or fortnight or whatever it is, until the whole thing comes into its own, as it were. So you've got individuals and you've got countries and you've got strong passions and curses which land as intended, and I'm really not going to spoil it, because if you like short stories and if you like this type of story, or if you like the author, I think you'll thoroughly enjoy the Poor Clare. I gave this story 5 stars, and an added bonus is that I'd never heard of a Poor Clare. I didn't know what it was. As she's writing this, it's clear that to her, every reader should know what the Poor Clare is, and apparently it's not nuns, but it's an order of women who dedicate their life to nursing, as far as I can gather. I should have googled that before I wrote this review too, shouldn't I? Okay, this book as well has the sweet innocent and another house in its centre. Moving on to Lois the Witch. Lois the Witch takes place in the New World of America. It starts on a little wooden dock of Boston, which is a developing town, in 1691. So it's being told much after when it happens. Lois Barclay has been forced to go searching for her estranged mother's brother in New England after her parents die. Her mother fell out of contact with her brother when he became a Puritan or something, and disavowed all the English version of Christianity, and went off to become something else. Odd. Whatever. I don't know. Anyway, once she gets there, she finds that she isn't expected. Her letter has fallen through. She finds an unwelcoming, stern society in which all the principles of religion, society, king, state, all the morals and ethics that she's grown up with and holds dear have been discarded and looked down upon. The puritanical household consists of the mother, the wife of her uncle who loathes her on sight, and she is lonely and miserable there. So this one was rather political. There was social commentary. There may actually be some witchcraft in there, but it's pretty deeply buried. It's exceptionally critical in a subtle and impressive way of the way in which the First Nations people, as we would know them today, or the Indians as they were known when the story was written, have been treated by Europeans. So it's got all those social aspects that I should like in a story, but I did not like this story at all. This was the only story in this collection that I DNF'd. You've still got your sweet innocent, that's Lois. But she's in this circumstance where her cousin wants to marry her. She doesn't want to marry her cousin. It's quite obvious she's going to be accused of doing witchcraft. Basically because either the mother doesn't want her to marry the son, or the son is angry that she won't marry him. There's going to be some sort of hanky-panky there. And I was just bored. I was really, really bored. The foreshadowing was too much for me. The tone was unpleasant, and it's a theme that I've read many times before. There's one of my favourite childhood books or teenage books I suppose, was The Witch of Blackbird Pond, for example, which is a very similar scenario. But this lacked charm. I didn't enjoy it. I DNF'd it less than halfway through. I remembered that I don't actually have to finish every single thing that I read. DNFing was a mystery that I didn't manage to solve until my late 30s, but now I've got it. Okay, it feels unnecessarily drawn out, as though Mrs. Gaskell was writing it for a serial periodical. Maybe she herself had lost interest in it, but she had to write a certain number of words, and she just kept drawing out the same... Anyway, DNF, 0 stars, negative stars, whatever. The next story is called The Doom of the Griffiths, and far from the dour old world Puritans, we get flung across the pond into Wales. Soft, green, moist Wales with its amazing mythology. Now, I am fascinated by anything Welsh. I'm fascinated by the language. I'm fascinated by the country, its history, all the things. So this was a great tale for me. It's a tale of the hereditary doom that lands upon a family after one ancestor does a hideous thing. So we start with Owain Glyndwr. Glyndwr or Glyndwr? If you know Welsh, tell me. And he's a genuine historical figure. He was a bit of a hero in his time. He led the Welsh revolt against England around 1400. I'm not clear on the details. I just kind of know that it happened. Now, my understanding is that no one really knows what became of Glyndwr. He just vanished. No one knows how he died or where he's buried. But in this story, it leans into the fact that he had been betrayed by his blood brother, Rhys ap Griffith? Griffith? One of them. I don't know. I clearly can't pronounce it. And I don't think that that's true. I think that's invented just for this story. But in this story, this friend, Rhys, who he loved like a brother and trusted more than he would his own family, betrayed him in some way. And though he survived that betrayal, he pronounced a curse on the family of Rhys, which is that the Griffiths would slowly decline in power, lose all their money, be miserable in sin, and finally the line would end with the son murdering his own father. So this is the story of the cursed family and how they ended up in a swampy, narrow vale by the sea in Wales, somewhere that I think might be in that large bay down the bottom of Wales. If Wales is here and this is England, there's think it's around there somewhere. Because it mentions... Never mind. Never mind. That's why I think it's better. Anyway, it's a fantastic story. I loved every second of it. And in the introduction, our wonderful introducer of this volume mentions that this is very much kind of an Oedipus Tyrannus retelling, and that Gaskell actually leans into that by having our main protagonist, the unhappy son who murders his father accidentally, as it happens, actually opening that book to read it earlier on in the novel. Great stuff. So the next one is another interesting one, The Ghost in the Garden Room, which is also called The Crooked Branch. Now, apparently Dickens requested this story for an 1850 something or other, 1859 something or other, Christmas issue of All the Year Round, what that was. So he was going to do an edition which was to be called The Haunted House, and certainly the house theme, once again, very much Mrs. Gaskell thing. And that reminded me of an interesting fact. Now, in this era of Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell, Christmas seems to have been a spooky time of year in the same way that people think October is these days. All Hallows Eve, I don't think was as big a thing in England, but Christmas, there's always ghost stories at Christmas. Interesting. Anyhow, so this story was either printed as The Crooked Branch, that's the one it's better known of as, or The Ghost in the Garden Room, which is the one it's printed as here. There's a prologue to it, which apparently hasn't always been printed with the story, but is here. It's a great introduction to the narration, which is introduced as being supplied by the story of a judge who is haunting a solicitor. And then we just dive into this incredibly thrilling, edge-of-your-seat, fascinating story. So it's about a son who is clearly the crooked branch that the story is named after. He grows up nice and sweet with nice parents, and his young cousin living in the house with them. But then his parents want better for him, so they send him to a boarding school, which apparently twists and turns him until he is no longer the sweet boy he used to be, and he does horrible, horrible things. The most interesting thing about this is that I believe it's set somewhere in northern England, and it's mostly narrated by Elizabeth Gaskell, but when the actual characters in it talk, they talk with this incredibly heavy colloquial accent, which I really enjoyed, and I certainly didn't always understand. You could always get the gist of it, but some of the words I'd never heard before. I loved that. So I loved every part of it, really. Great story. It kept me thinking about it long after I'd finished the story. And it's basically the story of a never-do-well son, which is fine. It's, again, you've got that house theme and you've got a sweet innocent. But I came away from going, well, that's more mystery and macabre. It's not so much ghosty. And then I remembered the prologue and went back and reread it and went, oh, no, this is totally a ghost story. But without the prologue, you wouldn't know. Okay, great story. Going on to The Grey Woman. Mystery and macabre. Mysterious and rather than supernatural. This is another marvellous story of a very young girl, once again, married to a sinister man. She is German and she grew up happy in a mill house. Mill houses seem to be the order of the month. But she went to stay with a friend in France, I think France, and ended up married to a Frenchman. He is a sinister, handsome, but scary man who she ends up becoming more and more afraid of after he takes her back to his chateau somewhere in France that I don't know, because my French topography is pretty bad. Nowhere near Paris, however, because we're in 1989-ish, which is revolution time for France. That's touched upon in passing on the story. Anyhow, when she gets back to this chateau, once again, the house and the sweet innocent theme. It's apparently this old castle in which her husband has his apartments, but then a new part has been built onto it where she has her apartments. She's very isolated. The servants seem unkind and even sinister in themselves. You get strong Bluebeard vibes from this for a long time before that really heavy hitting part of the story kicks in. It's absolute great story, nothing to do with Bluebeard, but worse. And it leans into some of Gaskell's very, very commonly used themes. Great story, told in hindsight through the lady in question having survived, not really a spoiler, and handing a letter to her daughter or possibly her brother to read about all her horrible experiences. 5 stars for that one as well. Fantastic. Okay, now we've got kind of the last story, or the second last. Curious If True. Now, Curious If True starts with an Englishman who's gone somewhere in France. He's trying to discover his heritage. Oh, what's his name? Wellington. I think it's Wellington. Worthington? Wellington. One of them. Something with a W. He's trying to find his heritage. He's staying in some small town in an inn. He goes for a walk in the afternoon, gets lost in the fields, and ends up at the end of a long dark avenue with trees, thrashing around in a wood, resigned to having to spend the night outside. When he suddenly sees a huge chateau all lit up, there's clearly a house party going on there. And he goes toward this house party, and he's already told us that it's a strange story that he wouldn't quite believe himself. And so we're assuming it's going to be ghosty. And this is toward the end of the book. So my introduction was a long way away. Anyway, he goes towards the house, and it's a strange mismatch of people from different types of society and different types of dress. And he tries to tell the butler who shows him in who he is and what he's doing there. But as soon as he gives his name, the butler goes, we were expecting you, and shows him in. So it's all pretty spooky and quite weird. Great story. I really enjoyed it. Now, where this actually hits home is that these days fairy tale retellings are everywhere. Everyone's done them, and some of them have done them very well. Sherry Tepper, Robin McKinley. Some of them have done them less well, but made a lot of money doing it. And Mrs. Gaskell preceded all of them, because this one's, Curious If True, is actually a house party for fairy tale characters. And our narrator has a name that has made them think he is a fairy tale character. He doesn't realize what's happening, and I didn't realize what's happening for nearly as long as he didn't, having forgotten the introduction. Now these people, some of them are named by a name that we would recognize them by if you spoke French, which in fact I don't, but eventually I got the hint. I went back and reread the section of the introduction where it talks about that, where he says, I referred to the variety of Gaskell's work in an earlier edition of this introduction, and there is no greater evidence of this trait than the cunning and comic tale, Curious If True, which has a modern satirical edge to it. It purports to be an extract from a letter from Richard Whittingham, that's it, Whittingham, Dick Whittingham and his cat. Our protagonist, Whittington, does have a cat, but not that cat, and is confused by the fact that all these strangers seem to know he's got a cat. It's really, really great. All these well-known characters from fairy tales that have moved on and to some extent centered in the real world. So you've got a Cinderella who's now lame from having worn 2 small shoes, and a whole host of other characters that I'm not going into, because seriously, if anything about this review sounds interesting to you, that's a great, great story. And if you love fairy tales, and I know some of you do, and you like fairy tale retellings, and according to the ratings out there on the fantasy side of BookTube, lots of people do, this story is magnificent and you should read it. I only gave it 4 stars, but I did say it was charming. I think the 4 stars were because it wasn't quite long enough. I could have done with more, and I had to Google the final line that happened before he wakes up again in the woods. I had to Google it quite a bit because I don't speak French and I didn't understand what it was getting at. I don't love books that make me Google. I started reading before Google. I think the book should do it themselves and not force me onto the internet. Okay, so for the final part of this book, Disappearances. Disappearances is the oddest story in this collection because it isn't really a story per se and as such. In Disappearances, Elizabeth Gaskell goes through her version, I suppose, of true crime. Once again, contemporary to the max. She's telling all these stories of people who disappeared in different ways and with different effects. And the interesting thing about Disappearance is she tells these stories from not that long ago, but before there was a police force, and she is totally fangirling the police force and how they would have discovered these crimes if they happened in her today. So great. Tales of Mystery and Macabre by Elizabeth Gaskell. I am so glad I finally got to it, and without Spooky October I might never have, because it's short stories. So I'm delighted at that. I have now finished all of the novels and at least one of the short stories that I had put by to read in October. And I've only got one more novel to go. At the end of sometime in October, I always try to reread Roger Zelazny's A Night in the Lonesome October. Look forward to a review from this one while I just gush about how much I love this book. What else I've got for October is, again, only short stories. And short stories and me have got limited capacity to make each other happy. So I've got a request for anyone who is a regular viewer of this channel or who just happened to watch one of my book hauls and noticed any spooky books that I have not reviewed. If you saw me hauling a book and you thought, hey, that's a spooky book, it's a good spooky book, can you please let me know what it was? Because I've got 2 piled up to read shelves there. I've been through them. I can't see anything that really seems to fit with Spooky October, but I would like to read more books in that theme this month. I might just be resigned to rereading. When did I read Dracula last? Dracula would work. Anyhow, if you're still watching, thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of our little corner of the BookTube community, which is a great community, and I'm delighted to be part of it. And read good books.